Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode with Intelligent Interviewers.
Today we will be talking about the podcast Against All Odds.
Against All Odds is a podcast about humans being put into a situation where most people wouldn't survive.
Everything from surviving a bear attack in remote Canada to hiking out of the Andes Mountains after a plane crash.
There are two different hosts that work on Against All Odds, Cassie DePical and Mike Corey. They all play an insanely important role in the podcast, as they each are the narrators of the story, and the special voices they use play a major role in how engaging the podcasts are.
Cassie DePical is a very interesting person, as she is mostly known not for being a host in Against All Odds, but for being the first documented woman to travel to every sovereign country in the world. She's also an author of the memoir Expedition 196.
Mike Corey is a Canadian adventure travel YouTuber. His channel, Fearless and Far, is a channel where he explores bizarre attractions, unique cultures, and conquers fears. He is a marine biologist graduate who switched from filmmaking after volunteering in ocean conservation.
They each cover different stories, and they each have their own unique way of doing it. Each story is usually grouped into a season with about 3 to 5 episodes in each season. Each episode is anywhere from 30 minutes long to 15 minutes long. In the episode, the host takes you through the story by using different voices.
In the episode Mauled by a Grizzly Bear, it takes us through the story of how Alex Messenger sets out on a 42-day remote trip in Canada. Him and the people he does it with are completely off the grid, so if something bad were to happen, they would have no way to get help. Only on day 29, Alex makes the decision to do a short solo hike up the ridge, where he is met face-to-face with the grizzly bear. This episode explains what happened after that and how the experience changes his life forever.
There are no new updates on the matter that we could find while we were researching.
There's a book written by Alex Messenger that shares his first account of his experience and contains more details than the podcast. Both the podcast and the book might have a bias, as there might be some events that happen that Alex doesn't want to share if they're embarrassing. This podcast is getting their information from Alex Messenger, so there's definitely a way for him to avoid something being known to the public.
Against All Odds also did a 5-episode series on a plane that crashed in the Andes Mountains. The episode covered the story from 1972 of the rugby team who was on their way to the next match, which was located in Santiago, Chile. Their plane crashed in the mountains after hitting a glacier. The episodes go through the conditions that seemed impossible to overcome. Without help coming to save them, no winter clothes, very little food, and freezing temperatures, surviving seemed impossible.
Although they did indeed survive the plane crash and the 2 months in the mountains with little food, all of it happened in 1972. Out of 16 survivors, 14 are still alive. Jose died from cancer in 2023, and Sergio died in 2020 at the age of 91.
There are hardly any differences in the content of the podcast and what is online now. The podcast did a really good job of getting all the facts in there. There are no contradictions that we found while doing research. There are new updates on who is still alive and who has unfortunately passed away. Now, there are a lot more first-hand accounts of what happened, as most of the survivors went on to become authors or motivational speakers. The podcast is very well known and also has a lot of reviews. On Apple Podcasts, there are 7,414 reviews. The average review is a 4.7 out of 5. There are lots of positive reviews talking about how they really enjoyed listening to the podcast.
In the negative reviews, however, the most common thing seen is that the fact that the older episodes they were cursing a lot, and most people were not fond of Cassie's voice. They were, however, okay with Mike's. The negative reviews also talked about how the listeners did not like how Cassie would do the voice acting. They believed it was bad, and they would rather listen to a first-hand account than Cassie.
Although there were negative reviews, the majority of the reviews were in fact positive. In the positive reviews, it was very common to see reviews talking about how they really enjoyed the storytelling and how they believe that Cassie and Mike did a lot of research on the topic and fully understood what they were talking about. There are also reviews talking about how they believe it is the survival story podcast. There are also many reviews talking about how they were very pleased with how immersive the podcast is with all of their audio additions and dialogue.
The Irish Times also did a review on Against All Odds. In the review, they wrote about how the podcast gets heavy-handed with heroism. The review also talks about how the best episodes were the ones with post-story interviews.
In our opinion, the podcast was overall very good, and we do agree with some of the negative comments on Apple Podcasts about who would rather listen to the first-hand accounts. The podcast itself is very good, and it does a very nice job of explaining the story well while keeping the listeners engaged. Cassie could improve on her voice acting in the podcast, as at times it does get a bit distracting and takes away from the story. The podcast structure does make it very easy to follow, and the audio and sound effects definitely play a key role in the podcast. The sound effects that are in the podcast makes each episode even more engaging. In some of the episodes, they have suspenseful music right before the climax and just music in general to fit the mood of the story. They do have sound effects as well, but only use them when it fits well within the story.
Against All Odds is a podcast about people who have survived the unthinkable. When most people would have given up, they kept going.